right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining. This is the Adolescent Mental Health webinar presented by the Illinois Chapter American Academy of Pediatrics. This will be addressing adolescent mental health concerns and considering neurofeedback as a care option, and it'll be presented by Dr. Elie Saltzman. So this webinar is available for CME credit. It is available for 1 AMA Category 1 credit through the Illinois State Medical Society. It is also available for continuing education credit through the Illinois Department of Human Services for the following licensed professionals. And just another welcome. This is part 3 of our adolescent health webinar series. This, the first one happened January 29th, and it was addressing health inequities in adolescent care. And then today we have adolescence and mental health. And our next webinar will be the social emotional aspect of adolescent health, happening March 26th. This is the webinar planning group, and also the CME application reviewers, as well as the content reviewers. So this webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available at our website at illinoisaac.org. And also during the webinar, participants will be muted, but please type your questions or comments into the chat box, and they will be answered at the conclusion of this presentation. So the presenter, myself, Olivia, the moderator, and the webinar planning group and content reviewers have no financial relationships to disclose. Also, just to make a note that funding was provided, funding for this webinar was provided by the Illinois Department of Public Health. So just to give a brief background of our presenter, Dr. Elie Saltzman is a licensed clinical psychologist with a specialization in children and adolescents. He earned his doctorate from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and his master's in vocational rehabilitation from the Illinois Institute of Technology. Dr. Saltzman has provided services and support to children, adolescents, adults, and families in settings such as partial hospitalization programs, residential services, therapeutic day schools, private practices, and outpatient clinics. Dr. Saltzman has focused much of his research and clinical work in the school setting, specifically in the development of anti-bullying programs and techniques. He currently works with both Cognitive Solutions Learning Center and Chicago Mind Solutions. In addition to his work as a psychologist, he also coaches a high school wrestling team in Skokie. This is myself. My name is Olivia. I'm the Public Health Activities Manager at ICAP, and also I will be putting my contact information in the chat box in case you have questions regarding this. And here are the learning objectives for this webinar: explaining mental health and its impact on adolescents, identifying trends in mental health using data, and also exploring neurofeedback therapy as a care option for adolescents. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Saltzman.
All right, thank you, Olivia. Welcome everyone. I'm very excited to be here and to discuss mental health and neurofeedback. So yeah, I guess let's jump into it. So Olivia, go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, we're gonna start off a little bit talking about mental health in general, mental health for adolescents specifically. Mental health overall, as I'm sure many of you know, it just includes our emotional, psychological, social well-being. There's a lot of ways we can measure it. Generally, in psychology, we talk about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It can help determine how we handle stress, relate to others, make choices. It's very important at every stage of life. Every stage of life is a little bit different when addressing and talking about mental health. I have my specialization in children and adolescents, and adolescence is one of those very pivotal moments in developing mental health responses, developing mental health in general, just kind of figuring out who you are as a person leading into adulthood. So it's a very important, we'll talk about that in a moment. All right, we go to the next one. Thank you. So yeah, during adolescence, as I mentioned before, it's a pretty important time in life. It's where we help develop our skills to becoming adults. and we have to help adolescents. As adolescents, we have to promote healthy sleeping patterns, good exercise, getting those coping mechanisms to be more adaptive than maladaptive in some way, teaching kind of executive functioning and interpersonal skills, so things like problem solving, learning how to attend and focus in difficult situations, and just generally building those interpersonal skills that are going to be very helpful throughout an adolescence as they enter into adulthood. Some of the things that can be really helpful with that are, supportive environments, making sure that like home life is important, is doing well, is supporting them in those ways. General wider community can really contribute a lot to these things as well. So everyone in an adolescent's life can contribute, or honestly, can be a detriment to the developing of healthy mental health. All right, move to the next slide. Thank you. Some of the risk factors, and these apply to everyone, but they're a little bit more relevant, they're a little bit more significant for adolescents. So, autonomy, the desire for greater autonomy, we've all been there. Going from teen to adult, trying to find your own way, presents a lot of stress that adults, children don't have to the same amount. Also in adolescence, they're dealing a lot with peer pressure. It's as we mentioned before, social interaction, figuring out who you are socially, can be a huge contributor to stress, can help develop those adaptive or maladaptive coping mechanisms as you're learning how your friends are behaving, seeing things like that, trying to fit in, all that stuff. Sexual identity exploration fits in with that autonomy, that peer pressure, to the development of a personality, development of who you are, figuring out your own way in life. Again, added stress. Nowadays, I know it maybe wasn't as relevant back when we were all kids or whatever, but now adolescents, there's a lot of social media out there, there's a lot of added pressures, a lot of things that are unknown about social media and how it's going to affect adolescents, adults, kids like that. Quality of life specifically, this is kind of what we were talking about before, quality of their home life, how many supports are in place, how many services are available, how mental health issues are addressed, how they're kind of just even talked about in a general sense, not like more individually. Peer relationships, again, huge issue. Are you learning from people who are going to help you be adaptive or maladaptive? I personally, as mentioned before, a lot of my research, a lot of my focus has been on trauma, bullying, things like that. So that's always going to be part of my presentations, things like that. And then general socioeconomic concerns, things like sexual violence, sexual abuse, general abuse and trauma. A little bit more general, kind of applies to everyone's mental health at all times. But again, during those pivotal times of being an adolescent, those things can contribute a little bit more so, help develop those coping skills. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. So yeah, a lot of those risk factors, if they're not addressed or if they're actually are risks, can lead to these kind of difficulties, disorders in adulthood. Emotional disorders, one of the big ones that usually emerge during adolescence. We talk about like the general ones, anxiety, depression, things like that. These also can include things like somatic symptoms, other kind of anything related to how your brain is processing your emotions around you. Similarly, we see a lot of behavioral disorders start to develop here. This can include things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, things like conduct disorder, just kind of general patterns of aggression or avoidance, things that, again, as adolescents are developing their coping mechanisms, whether or not they are going to be more adaptive. Quite common in adolescence, we see eating disorders. There's a large prevalence of that as well. Again, in all of these things, we see them in adults, we see them in children. It's just this is when a lot of those things kind of start developing in adolescence. Psychosis can happen. It's generally not the biggest disorder worldwide. It's not the biggest disorder for any population. But again, this is also that age range where we start seeing some of the things that are leading to psychosis. We'll start seeing some of the patterns that can eventually turn into psychosis. Also coming on for other risk factors that can lead to suicide and self-harm. Suicide, self-harm is the third leading cause of death for adolescents aged 15 to 19. It's pretty significant. It's definitely tied in to all these other things, specifically the emotional disorders. And things like suicide, self-harm are easily exacerbated by poor quality of life, low SCS. Things like media use, influence from friends have a huge impact on whether or not an adolescent will engage in these kind of behaviors. And finally, the risk factors can lead to things like risk-taking behaviors, things like developing those maladaptive strategies. Here we talk a lot about like drugs, alcohol, risky sexual behaviors, things like that. Ways that adolescents find to cope with the experiences they're going through that are not super helpful. In general, adolescents are also more prone to things like social exclusion, stigma from the others around them. A lot of times they aren't ready to seek help. And a lot of times, because they're still in school, because they're in a pivotal place in school, we see a lot of educational difficulties as well. All right, let's move on. Thank you. Addressing mental health, particularly during adolescence, is important. Some of the reasons why it's super important, mental health conditions account for 16% of the global disease burden, which doesn't sound like a lot, 16%, but when we talk about the kind of things that mental health can lead to, we're looking at kind of the bigger picture later on in adulthood and stuff like that. As we were kind of mentioning before, half of the mental health conditions begin at 14 years old, and a lot more of them come later, like within that still age range, 14 to 19, a little into the 20s, things like that. So it's a very important age where we start seeing these things develop. It's important to address them early. It's important to address them correctly, things like that. And an estimated 10 to 20% of adolescents globally experience mental health conditions, and many of them remain undiagnosed or undertreated, which is part of what we're going to be discussing in a second as well. Mental health sometimes gets a strange position when we talk about like global disease burden. Sometimes it's seen as unimportant, it's not relevant, maybe sometimes even not real by certain people or agencies. And in that case, a lot of cultures don't give a lot of emphasis towards mental health difficulties. And that's where some of these difficulties with diagnosis and treatment can happen. They don't seek out the families or the adolescents themselves don't seek out appropriate treatment, appropriate evaluations of things like that. The consequences of mental health, we talked about the risk factors a little bit, but they extend into adulthood, they can impair physical and mental health. They limit the opportunities to live fulfilling lives as adults. Something, the way I always like to think about it is this is the time where we can kind of nip it in the bud. If we get it here, we don't have to kind of deal with it on a higher scale, a more severe scale later on. All right, let's go on to the research stuff now, the fun stuff. Thank you. I'm sure, most of you know about this or heard about this, have dealt with this in some way, but we're going to talk about it anyhow. Common mental health disorders among adolescents. We mentioned a couple of them here, but we can talk a little bit more in detail. We have kind of those emotional issues, difficulties like anxiety and depression. A little bit lower down, the bipolar disorder, manic depressive, things like that start coming up. We start seeing those emotional issues leading to those maladaptive behaviors. Again, we talk about ADHD, how we see a lot of those executive functioning issues as the adolescents' brains are developing, more specifically the frontal lobe, which we'll talk about. We can see some of those patterns start to form, some of those connections maybe aren't being made in the most optimal or ideal way, and we can start seeing some of these patterns of difficulties with attention, focus, problem solving, all that stuff. Also, as we mentioned before, eating disorders, very, definitely, again, affects all ages, all age ranges. But it's definitely a little bit more prevalent in adolescence. It's one of the more concerning factors in adolescence. All right, let's go on to the next one. Thank you. This comes from the Mental Health America website, where they rank all the states in America on how they fit for providing services to adolescents with mental health. They have one for adults also, but we're going to focus on adolescents. And there are 7 different measures that they use to make this ranking. They give us an overall ranking. The way this works is, 1 through 13 have lower prevalence of mental health and a higher rate of access for care. 30, the higher the number, kind of the worse it is. I don't want to say it like that, but that's kind of how it goes. Illinois overall ranks 27th when we take into the 7 factors, which we'll go over in a moment. So, kind of right there in the middle, a little bit below the middle. Yeah, so we can go on. Let's go on to the next one. We'll talk about kind of what those measures are. Thank you. So yeah, these are the 7 measures, and these are where Illinois ranks on them specifically. So yeah, one major depressive episode, MDE, we rank 38th. As you can see, the numbers in general a little bit high, but some of them towards the end not as high, which is nice. Number 2, a severe major depressive episode, we ranked 34th. Substance use disorder, 37. No access to mental health services, 24. Severe major depressive episode with consistent treatment, 29. That's the one that I kind of hung my hat on a little bit more. I was focusing on that because it accounts for both a emotional disturbance as well as treatment. Number 6, child and adolescents with private insurance that didn't cover mental health, 11, so that's pretty good. And students identified with emotional disturbance for an individualized education program, also known as an IEP, 14. So definitely some areas where, Illinois needs, we need to work on a little bit. It seems, based on these numbers, and this is by, just a kind of quick look at these kind of things. But, in Illinois, we're definitely seeing a high rate of mental health issues, one major depressive episode, severe major depressive episode, substance use disorder, all ranked pretty high, considering, I know Illinois is a big state, but considering that Chicago has a pretty major role in the amount of people in Illinois, and it's a pretty well-developed city. But at the end of the day, doing well in school is nice, and having children and adolescents who actually have access, at least through insurance that cover mental health. At least there's some room there where it seems like we might be able to grow, to do a little better in that area. Yeah, I think we can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. These are some of the Illinois mental health policies that have been, a little bit newer, I think since 2020, awesome. Yeah, so public colleges in Illinois are now required to develop programs to address students with mental health. I think that speaks a little bit to that IEP number we saw before, definitely taking care to make sure that our schools are addressing mental health where we can. I did a lot of my experiences, a lot of my research were done in schools, and there's definitely a lot out there that shows how important schools are, as important as families are, as important as social relationships are. Kids and adolescents spend most of their days in school, spend most of their time with those adults, the teachers. So it's super important, and even in colleges. So it's super important that we have access for adolescents in those agencies. All insurance plans after December 31st are now required to fund coordinated specialty care for first episode psychosis in a child or young adult under age 26. Very helpful. Those psychosis instances aren't the most prevalent, or not the most severe, not severe, but the most prevalent thing with adolescents, but it's definitely something that can lead to a much more severe issue in adulthood. So again, hitting it a little bit earlier, making sure it's dealt with appropriately is very important. And the Illinois Department of Human Services is required to create and maintain an online database that provides mental health resources for students, school staff, and parents. So again, just making sure that people are aware of their options, are aware of their resources. Getting access to it is another hurdle that we'll have to come over, but at least people will be able to find a place where they can see what they need, can see what is available to them. All right, we go into the next one. Thank you. So, COVID obviously has changed a lot of things, is affecting everyone. It's placed significant burdens on teens and adolescents' mental health. During the pandemic, a larger than average share of young adults reported symptoms for anxiety and or depression. 56% of young adults between 18 and 24, which is a pretty high number for anything, reported those symptoms. 25% of young adults and adolescents are more likely to use substances, again, due to COVID, and 26% are more likely to have increased suicidal thoughts, definitely related to those emotional disturbances, and just in general, the difficulties that COVID has presented. All right, can we go on to the next one? Thank you. Many adolescents' social and emotional mental well-being has been affected by COVID, the pandemic. Trauma faced at this developmental stage might have long-term consequences on their lifespan. Some of the things that COVID has changed, has contributed to these difficulties is the changes in the routine. I don't know about the rest of you, but when my routine is disrupted, I don't know how to explain, like my chi feels off. I don't know what else to say. Something's going on. I can't tell what it is, and as I'm not able to get back into a routine, it just gets worse and worse. And I think COVID, this has been tough for all of us. Adolescents even more so. I don't know, I can't imagine what it's like for teens at this juncture with this pandemic. Online education, I think, is definitely related to that change in routine. Again, I can't imagine what it would be like to go to school at home on the computer all day long. But just those added stresses of not being in class, not seeing your peers, if that's where you're at, not having the, as good as the online education has been in a lot of places, a lot of schools are really doing a great job. It's never quite going to be the same. I know we have to do teletherapy, and as much as it's working, as much as it's okay, there's still something that's missing from that in-person interaction. Well visits to the doctors, making sure it's more difficult to achieve those sort of things. People generally being told, like, if you don't have to come in, don't come in. Even when you do have to come in, it's harder to get appointments. Things like that, just the kind of things that prevent, preventative measures for mental health in general, harder to do during COVID. Missed significant life events, and kind of missed opportunities in general for adolescents. Again, pivotal time. There's a lot of things that happen during adolescence, young adulthood, experiences that those people have, and missing out on those experiences, whether it's with significant others, whether it's with family or friends, or whether it's just experiencing the world. COVID is kind of stopping that development, at least slowing it down for a little bit. And finally, the loss of security and safety. Our world was turned upside down for adolescents. It's a little bit even more important for children. Also, adults, we're a little bit more, we understand a little bit better. But for everyone, the loss of security and safety kind of related to that routine, not feeling like what's going to come next, not feeling like where you're at, definitely has it's a kind of almost like a trauma response. You don't know what's going to happen or what is. Definitely can impact those developing brains, those development of those coping mechanisms. All right, let's go on to what can we do about that. After talking about all the bad things going on, here's hopefully a little bit more a light at the end of the tunnel. So yeah, what I do, Olivia mentioned a little bit earlier. I work for neurofeedback clinics, and we provide this neurofeedback therapy. So we're talking about a little bit how that works in general, how can it help with some of the things we mentioned for adolescents and for adults. It works for lots of people. So neurofeedback is a subset of biofeedback and neurofeedback. But biofeedback in general uses kind of external information to inform the person who is receiving that information about changes in their own body. It's this feedback kind of loop. And it can help regulate intentional and unintentional processes. One example that I always use, this is an example of biofeedback. We'll get into neurofeedback in a moment. But let's say you have a little pulse ox reader on your finger. You can see where your heart rate is at. You can just kind of see how fast your pulse is. Say you're anxious, say you're nervous about something, and then you come in and you're taught how to breathe, how to slow your breathing down, breathing through your nose, out through your mouth, count your seconds, imagine a happy place, whatever it is. You can then monitor how your pulse is responding to your breathing. This is how the feedback loop within biofeedback works. We're changing. This one's more of a conscious, intentional process, but we are seeing how our body is responding to the differences that we're making in our breathing patterns. You're getting the feedback from your pulse. You can see it's like, oh, am I doing this right? If your pulse is slowing down, which is the goal, yeah, I'm breathing correctly. I'm doing this process right. If I'm not, if your pulse isn't changing or if it's going up, then no, I'm not doing this right. I have to change. I have to change how I'm breathing. This is just an example of how we can use, again, those external information to regulate our own body processes. Hopefully, what would this then do is when you're in those situations, when you're feeling anxious, when you're feeling nervous, when you can tell your heart rate is up, it's also something that biofeedback helps, is just to notice your biological processes, your physiological processes. You can then bring these skills in, and you can realize, oh, I gotta breathe here, I gotta slow myself down. Neurofeedback does a little bit of both. It's a little bit of that unintentional and intentional process, and yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more. Thank you. When we are doing neurofeedback, we are using Eeg Brainwaves as the feedback source to regulate various functions of the brain. So for instance, in the example I gave before, we were using a person's heart rate, their pulse. In this situation, we're using Eeg Brainwaves. The brainwaves we generally look at kind of go in groups of 4. The numbers here are if you different texts are going to give you slightly different numbers, but I did it this way because in general the first few jump up by 4. So we have our delta brainwave, which is generally 1 hertz 1 through 4. These are going to be the big, slow, sleepy waves when we see them on the computer. This is associated with deep sleep. This, you want these brain waves when you're going to sleep, when you are asleep. For some of the different stages, I mean, that's another presentation entirely. But yeah, 1 through 4 represents deep sleep and can sometimes represent underactivity in different areas of the brain. The next one up, the next slightly faster brainwave that we look for is theta. This is representative from 4 to 8, 5 to 8, 4 to 7, depends. Again, depends on where you're reading it. This is also somewhat related with sleep. This is also the area where we encode information. I think there's a story about Ben Franklin. I can't remember exactly who it was, but he would put a symbol, like a drum symbol, on the floor and hold a brick in his hand. And as he was getting drowsy, the brick would fall out of his hand, hit the symbol, wake him back up, and then he'd write down his crazy ideas or whatever. Because this is that. So when you're starting to drift off, but you're not quite there, that's theta. Again, this is also where we encode information. The next one, alpha, again, numbers are weird, 8 to 12, things like that. This one is associated with being kind of relaxed, but also ready. I had one professor who used to define this as, if you can imagine a panther sitting in a tree. They're all, the silky kind of relaxed body, they're just kind of resting on that branch. But if something comes by that it's ready to pounce, it doesn't need to like wake up, it doesn't need to do anything to kind of activate, it's just ready to go. So that's alpha. Then we go into beta. Again, this is a much larger range. There's some other things going on here with beta, but beta is when we're active. It's when the part of your brain is being used actively. We see it's a very fast wave at that point. This is what you want to have happen when you are actively thinking, solving a math problem, running in place, whatever. There's also a lot of other waves at the higher level. There's high beta. There's also something called low beta. Again, different presentation. So high beta, gamma, things much higher. It's very active. Those are kind of a beta, high beta, everything like 13 and up, kind of clumped together to a certain capacity. For the purpose of this presentation, that can kind of be one thing. All right, let's go on to the next one. Thank you. When we use the neurofeedback process, when at least with us, there are other systems out there, whatever. We use something called the 10-20 system. That's based on 21 different points on the scalp that the brain is responsible for, things like that. Different parts of the brain are responsible for different things. Some of the responsibilities of the brain that we generally address, and this is not a complete list, but emotional regulation, executive functioning, sleep, motor control, sensory processing, achievement, in school, reading, writing, and math kind of stuff. Social functioning, language, personality, and traumatic brain injury is another big one. Again, I say this to a lot of our clients all the time, or for prospective clients. If the brain is responsible for it, we can do something about it usually. There's different levels of research for different things within the brain. It's a little bit more complicated than just like, this part of your brain is sleep, this part of your brain is vision or whatever. There are networks in the brain as well. We're not going to get into that today. But when we do the points, there are things that they're associated with. There are things that parts of the brain are associated with in general. I'm sure if you've taken a kind of basic neuroanatomy class, you learned about how the frontal lobe is responsible for executive functioning, how the temporal lobe does memory, some auditory processing. The occipital lobe is back here, the vision, a lot of visual processing in sleep. Parietal lobe, the sensory integration and stuff like that. And then I guess for neurofeedback, there's actually kind of another lobe that you might not have. So we have what's called the central strip, the sensory motor strip, which is the back of the frontal lobe and the front of the parietal kind of mixed together. That's a pretty important one in neurofeedback, and it does a lot of the sensory motor control. There's sleep involved in there as well, but yeah, some fun stuff. All right, let's go on to the next one. Thank you. Based on what the brain is responsible for, based on kind of like mental health in general, these are some of the general diagnoses. And again, the list is more expansive than this, but here's a lot of stuff we see generally, at least in our agencies, and within the research as well. So ADHD, without doing any actual studies about what neurofeedback treats, this is probably the biggest one. Lots of people coming in for executive functioning difficulties, wanting to target that frontal lobe, especially when we're talking with the adolescents, children, things like that, having difficulties in school, having difficulties focusing. ADHD is a pretty important one. Then we get, we see a lot of the emotion regulation, we see a lot of the anxiety, depression coming along, so we can address that as well. That's a pretty big one as well. So a lot of times we see that comorbid with the ADHD as well. TBI, I know we didn't talk about too much TBI, but I'm going to do a little bit of a plug for neurofeedback. It's one of the most, there's not a lot of treatments out there for traumatic brain injury in general, and neurofeedback, neuromodulation, which we'll get into in a minute, can be very effective for traumatic brain injury. It's one of those areas that kind of makes neurofeedback unique. Can also do things with PTSD, how memories are encoded, how memories and emotions are related, part of, I don't know if I like to jump around a little bit, but I don't think we address this. While we do address individual areas of the brain, part of what we also do during neurofeedback is talk about, measure, and we can regulate kind of communication between two areas of the brain. So PTSD has its associations with, memory encoding as well as the emotional content that's associated with those memories. So we can address kind of the network that's there. We can address that communication between the two on top of just whatever emotional or behavioral difficulties are being seen through PTSD. Similar to the traumatic brain injuries mentioned before, migraines is headaches in general, but migraines is something that neurofeedback, neuromodulation can address kind of uniquely, I think. Again, I don't know too much about other treatments, other therapies that are specifically helpful, useful, that have the same kind of research base that neurofeedback does for TBI and migraines. Some other things we can address: movement disorders, things like Tourette's, tics, learning disabilities, as I mentioned before, reading, writing, math, that achievement. There's a lot of research for that. Behavioral challenges, things like impulsivity, conduct disorders, that's related to kind of social interaction as well. So we can address those issues. And then symptoms of autism. We put autism on there. It's not like there's a part of the brain or even a network that's like, oh, this one's for autism. But there are symptoms of autism that we can make changes in: executive functioning, things like the social changes, and things that we can see in like the behavioral challenges as well. All right, let's go to the next one. Thank you. So if you are interested in neurofeedback, the way it works, the way the process works, is you would come in initially for an assessment. I think one of the things that I really love about neurofeedback within the field of psychology is that in general, psychology, psychiatry, we're not so well known for actually identifying where an issue is physiologically. If you go somewhere and you just say, like, I'm having trouble focusing, all right, that's somewhere in your brain, great. If you go to a cardiologist and you say, something's wrong with my heart, we can look at your heart. They can do scans, they can do tests and see what is it that's going on with your heart that's difficult. If you break your arm, you can get an X-ray and see like where is the break, and the treatment can be more specific to your specific difficulty. When it comes to psychology, that's not always the case. It's usually actually not the case. We can't see what's going on. For neurofeedback, we can. When we put we have these little like swimmer's caps, and they have all those 21 points are being measured. And we just have you sit there and just kind of chill out for 20, 30 minutes or so. And that gives us a reading that we compare to a normative database of where your different areas are performing. Are some of them going too fast? Are some of them going too slow? Again, we bring in that communication. We can see how different areas are talking to each other, how they're related. Using that information along with the reports you're coming in with, along with kind of other psychological assessments that we might run, we can generate what's called a protocol. We'll say what kind of treatment you're going to receive. You can see for 3 and 4, and I'll talk about those in a second. The avatar or lens, that's what we do. There's other ones as well, but those are the ones we focus on. I'm going to focus mostly on those. So we come up with a protocol. So say what placements are going to be used, what kind of treatments are we going to use, which of the waves are we going to address, and how are we going to change them, things like that. Once the assessment is done, once the protocol has been made for you, you come in for the training. Training happens once or twice a week, generally. If you can't make it that long, we can do once a week. With people 3 a week, but generally we aim for twice a week. And the way it works is, we place sensors on the scalp where those problematic areas have been identified. we plug those into the computer and we just tell the computer, all right, when those brain waves are functioning in the ranges that we think are more appropriate, that we have seen through research and through the math that we think are more appropriate, provide some sort of reward. It's operant conditioning. The reward many times, at least in our clinics, is we actually have the people watch a movie, sitting in a nice comfy chair, get to kind of choose a movie from a large database that we have, and as the brain is performing, so we'll go one at a time, on the more unconscious side of things, as the brain just kind of performs on its own, as it kind of naturally changes, as it modulates itself, the brain's always changing. The screen will, or the movie will turn to color or black and white. There's other settings, it can pixelate or things like that. Little sparkles can come on the screen. It all depends. There's a lot of different settings. It's kind of fun for the kids. And then the brain learns like, oh, this is what I want to do. This is where I want to be. These are the areas I want to perform at. It starts to stay, it starts to stick over time. And then we see those changes, those behavioral changes, those life changes, start to happen, albeit slowly sometimes, but people will start coming in and saying, oh, things are different. On the more conscious side of things, we can actually also have you engage in activities and see how that affects the brainwaves, to see how that affects the movie you're watching. Try and relax, try and focus, do some math problems, close your eyes, see what happens. All those different things can kind of also help a person to notice and regulate their physiological processes, as we mentioned before, like with the breathing and the pulse. The changes that occur with neurofeedback can be a little bit slow, can be kind of unnoticed sometimes. More often than not, when again, haven't done like a study on this one, but more often than not, when someone comes in and is reporting changes, they're more saying what other people are telling them about themselves. A lot of times people don't really even notice. There's some real fun stories out there on YouTube or other things like that where you can see people, usually providers, talking about some of the interesting changes they've seen, the interesting reports they've got from some of their clients, kind of like not noticing they're better. But yeah, it's pretty interesting, especially when you can see it from the outside and you see those changes. So yeah, again, that's kind of how it works over time. As things change, we will go back and we'll do what's called a remap. At least that's what we call it, where we kind of do that initial QEEG map again. What we're looking for after usually about 40 sessions, again, it can take a while. What we're looking for is what changes have been made. How is the brain actually functioning differently? And we have the actual comparison from the first one. Again, it's another kind of benefit of neurofeedback that we can actually see those changes. After that, we might change the protocol, we might change the positions, we might change the waves, or we might say, hey, there's not much more we can do. Thanks a lot for coming. The two main types of neurofeedback that I'm familiar with that we provide at the clinics I work are called the brain avatar and the lens. The brain avatar uses that operant conditioning. We can usually do about 4 placements at once, and it's plugged into the computer. We just program it, and it just kind of runs on its own. Usually sessions for brain avatar last about 30 minutes. Again, we try to go twice a week, and it's pretty much exactly what we're explaining here. The lens is a little bit different. The lens stands for low energy neurofeedback system. And what that is the placements are, we only do about, maybe we do 4 to 6 placements at a time, and a very low energy signal is sent in. It's 1/1,000,000th the strength of a cell phone signal. So a very low signal is sent in. This is for this is where the TBI and the migraines come in a lot. A lot of times when we see people who've had traumatic brain injury, there sometimes isn't enough to work with to do the brain avatar or something like that. So the lens can kind of help kickstart some of those things. The lens basically forces whatever area you're targeting, the lens forces those areas of the brain to fire a certain way, to communicate a certain way. And again, that can kickstart some of the same processes that we'd like to see. If you're in for a lens or something, over time when we're seeing changes, sometimes you can move to the brain avatar. It gets a little bit more training because you have a little bit more exposure, and it's a little bit more organic. There are other types. I used to work at a different location, and they had something called a signet. There's other types of biofeedback, more biofeedback type of processes that can work alongside with neurofeedback. Imagine doing the pulse meter along with neurofeedback. You can monitor your heart rate and see how your heart rate is affecting your brainwaves. Lots of fun stuff to do there. But yeah, like I said, we mostly focus on the brain avatar and the lens. All right, let's go on to the next slide. I think there's a double. Oh, there we go. All right, so some of the benefits of neurofeedback, and it's not necessarily just unique to neurofeedback, but I think one of the ones that is really unique to neurofeedback is the implications it has for medication. I'm definitely biased. I love neurofeedback, and I'm not the biggest fan of pharmacological interventions, especially for kids and adolescents. So where medicines, where drugs can, they target more the chemical imbalances, the chemical communication in the brain. Neurofeedback targets the electrical. And again, something that is, I think, the biggest promotion for neurofeedback is that we can target specific areas in the way we want to, whereas medications, will target the whole brain. You want to stimulate the frontal lobe, well, you're also going to be stimulating the amygdala. We don't have to do that. We can just target what we want to target and change it the way we want to change it. In a similar vein, it's a kind of more of a natural process. It's the same, operant conditioning. It's the same way we train children, to behave appropriately. It's the same way we train ourselves to behave appropriately. There's not a lot of kind of external, you're not really making huge changes here and there. It makes it more of a slow process. It can make it somewhat of a frustrating process, but at least we have kind of that natural pull. Neurofeedback also has a pretty low instance of negative side effects. There's at the very greatest, a lot of times what we'll see is just like a headache that lasts for a little while, which is obviously not ideal. There's ways we can change that. Some of those negative side effects are more prevalent in the lens rather than the brain avatar, but still, we try to avoid them as much as possible. Neurofeedback also can help preventative measures. Some of the early studies for neurofeedback were on like animals, and animals that received certain types of training were then used later on in other studies. And the researchers in the second studies were curious that these second studies weren't related to neurofeedback. The researchers in the second study had like these two different outcomes, and then they realized some of the animals that were used had previously had this neurofeedback training and were less susceptible in the case of this study, they were less susceptible to seizures. So there's some interesting preventative stuff that comes from neurofeedback as well. All right, then let's go on to the next slide and talk about some of the things out there to just kind of generally how this is, a little bit for neurofeedback, but also a little bit just for mental health in general. So there's the National Neurofeedback Network, websites provided down there, looking up to see what's out there, maybe in your area. We have locations in Chicago, downtown, and Northbrook. So, come on over. But if you're not in those areas, feel free to look around. There's plenty of people out there, plenty of good practitioners doing the work. All right, let's go on to the next one. This is the American Academy of Pediatrics. Just some other tools, some other things to look for. Just some more resources to address mental health for adolescents and kids. So let's keep going on to the next one. Thank you. Some tools, specifically some mental health tools for pediatrics, working with kids, things like that. Go on, next one, please. Thank you. NAMI, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Lots of great resources for lots of things. They have the specific sections for the teens and young adults. Just great more other places to look for different things, for different you need access, you need resources, things like that. Let's keep going. Thank you. Another website talking about COVID specifically. It's just where we are these days. Making sure your mental health during COVID-19, some signs you can look for that you might need more support, just some of those early warning signs. Okay, let's go to the next one. Oh, we're there. Excellent, sorry. This is the National Association of Pediatric Practitioners. Yeah, same stuff as before. We can go on to the next one. This is just more, more resources. All right, this is Call for Calm. This is, a little bit more of like the emergency kind of services if you need something more immediately, someone to talk to. Definitely call someone who can help. You can definitely let your kids, if you're working with kids, let them know this is available for them. We can't all have, emergency hours. We don't all have those kind of on-call services. So if you don't, this is something you can rely on a little bit more. All right, let's go on. Thank you. Again, at CDC, I'm sure we've all heard of that. Yeah, if you wanted some stuff specifically about how mental health, with adolescents is affected by COVID-19, some resources for that. CDC, they have some good stuff. Definitely look into there, see what is available specifically around COVID. And then the last one. Thank you. The SAM, the Society for Adolescents, Health and Medicine. Just again, more resources. Check all these out. If you're looking for something, you have questions, you don't know where to go. Going through all these things, asking those questions, really doing some research into all this stuff. Hopefully, we'll find what we need, and we can avoid some of those things we were talking about earlier. Those problems that adolescents can kind of lead to into adulthood. All right. Thank you. We go on. And so yeah, some of the takeaways from this presentation, mental health is important in every stage of life. I had all my training. I'm a child adolescent psychologist, so I'm always going to say it's more important in children and adolescents. I may be biased about that. We'll have to look into it. But no, it is important at every stage of life, but definitely addressing it appropriately and accurately in adolescence can help be preventative, can help develop those skills later on. It's a critical time to address mental health, and again, if it's left untreated, it can progress into adulthood. Addressing social determinants and health disparities can help mitigate the burden of mental health on adolescents and families. And again, another plug for neurofeedback therapy. It's definitely kind of an unknown care option, so I'm happy that I can provide a little bit here. It can provide lasting benefits. I don't think I mentioned this before, but as that training kicks in, as you stick with it longer and longer, we see long-term benefits. Sometimes people have to come in for like a booster session, but we see long-term changes. We see long-term permanent changes. If you are, I don't think I mentioned this before, if you are seeking out neurofeedback therapy for yourself, or if you have a client, make sure you are getting it from a qualified provider. Some of the things to look for is something called a BCIA. It's a board certification in neurofeedback. Something else called a QEEG certification is also something that just kind of shows a person's competency and experience in neurofeedback. All right, then we got that's the next slide, just some references.
Yes. So thank you. That was amazing. We do have questions. So I would like to get to those, if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay, so the first question that we have, let me open up the chat box here. The first question that we have is, because LGBT teens are at higher risk for depression and anxiety, when a teen tells me they are not heterosexual, how do you recommend helping support them? Or any advice on what is beneficial for them to hear?
I'm sorry, what was the second part of that question?
The second part was, or any advice on what is beneficial for them to hear?
Sure. Yeah, and unfortunately, I think for a lot of these questions, the answer is going to sound like it depends. Definitely check out some of those resources that we provided before. There's going to be some stuff specifically for the LGBT community. It's going to be very dependent. I think something to really always keep in mind when dealing with LGBT, when you're dealing with adolescents who are questioning their sexual identity and things like that, is the culture that they come from, the culture that they're in, their society, their environment. Making sure that it's taken into account as they take this journey through coming out, letting people know, as they learn about themselves. Something that I find myself telling a lot of parents and other practitioners as well, when questions about LGBT come up, is that always remember, it's a journey, it's a process. It's not, it is fluid. So hanging your hat on something, saying this is who I am, this is how I identify, that's great if you can do it, and if not, that's okay too. If you do hang your hat and then it changes, that's all right as well. No one can really tell you who you are other than yourself.
Thank you. The next question that we have is, I'm sorry, that ended it. But the next question that we have is, what is the minimum cognitive level that is needed for success with neurofeedback?
Excellent question. And I would say it's not actually related to cognitive level. I think the minimum cognitive level is, can you receive reinforcements? Like, does operant conditioning work for you? You don't even have to, it doesn't even have to be visual. We have auditory. You have to have some sort of sensory, although I guess you could even use tactile, like you can even tap if you have someone who has visual and auditory difficulties. You have to be able to receive the information. You have to be able to some capacity link the reward you're getting with the external changes that are happening. Doesn't take much, and the truth of the matter is we'll see kind of what we're looking for on that initial brainwave. I'm sorry, on that initial brain map. There is a story of, in one of the clinics I work, of a young girl who came in who had lost almost all brain functioning, and so we couldn't really do anything. That came up in the initial map. So you don't need a ton of cognitive awareness abilities. Again, just enough to kind of be susceptible, to the operant conditioning works on you.
Thank you. The next question is, how durable are the changes observed after neurofeedback?
I'm going to assume durable means like long lasting, but I'm not 100% sure. But either way, I guess, the changes we see, whether in the moment or, because sometimes we can actually see changes like in session. We'll see people come in, specifically with lens. We'll see people come in, and when they leave, they are different. That doesn't usually last. It lasts a little bit. Then when they come back, they've reverted, but it lets us know we're in the right area. But over time, we definitely see people who have come in, they've done their training, they've reported feeling changes. We can see changes in the remaps, and then we never hear from them again. So I can only assume that it's worked and they didn't need us anymore. Sometimes we definitely need people who come back. A lot of times, at least in my experience, that happens when we kind of suggest, hey, maybe wait a little bit longer to solidify these changes. But for when it's done correctly, long-term permanent changes, again, maybe sometimes need a booster here or there, but again, changes that can last forever.
Thank you. So the next question is, could you please provide references that back up the efficacy of neurofeedback in treatment of ADHD, anxiety, depression? Also, could you please comment on insurance coverage?
I can definitely do the first one, not so much the second one, sorry. I'll do a little bit of the second part of that question. Yeah, I think we can do that. I don't have any, off the top of my head with me, but I definitely have my big old book right here. I'll look through a little bit. I can provide that to Olivia, and we can send that out, I assume.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah. I can send them out in the email. So when we receive when I send the email for the PowerPoint and the recording and everything, then I'll also include those references there.
Sure. Let me just mark that down. And as far as insurance goes, what I'm somewhat familiar with, again, not the most insurance savvy person here, but the initial map can be covered by like an assessment code, the same assessment codes we use when we're doing just like a neuropsychological evaluation, learning disability, ADHD, giving the WISC or whatever. And then the sessions can be covered under just like psychotherapy, if that makes sense. Again, I don't actually know the answers to those questions.
Thank you.
No problem.
What are the best ways for public aid patients to access neurofeedback therapies?
That's an excellent question, and it's going to depend on the school itself. I don't know of many schools that maybe have it in-house. I do work with one program that provides the neuropsychological testing, the kind of neurological evaluations you're talking about, as well as some neurofeedback treatment to their students. We will work with a sliding scale. We'll work at a lower cost for kids, adolescents, even adults who need that sort of thing. Usually, I would say your best bet is to find a practice, a neurofeedback practice, and develop a relationship with them. I think it might be a little strange, a little out of the norm to like hire a psychologist, someone who has a board certification in neurofeedback, just to come into the school to provide that therapy. But yeah, if you can go for it.
Thanks. So how is neurofeedback assessments being welcomed and accepted as part of IOEPs by public schools? I work with foster children, and IOEPs are a massive hurdle.
I'm not familiar with IOEP. Is that similar to an IEP?
If you can follow up, that would be, oh, yes, they said yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, so can you say the question one more time?
So how is neurofeedback assessments being welcomed slash accepted as part of IOEPs by public schools? And this person works with foster children, and those are a massive hurdle.
Yeah, neurofeedback is a little strange. So I provide neurofeedback therapy and treatment, and I also do kind of testing. And when I do testing, I'll often recommend neurofeedback. Again, I'm totally biased. I've seen some places where it's been like welcomed with open arms. People are, they're super interested in it. It brings a lot of interesting benefits. And see other places that they're just going to shoot it down, right? It's not so well known. Sometimes it can feel like it's this brand new thing. Like, what are you doing to my head? You're going to mess with my brain. So I've seen both sides of things, unfortunately. It's really going to depend on how you can market it, I suppose. It depends on the people you're working with in the schools. I'm more than happy, and I know the other people I work with as well, would be more than happy, to go into certain schools, to give more presentations, things like that, putting people at ease and explaining how the whole process works. It can be super helpful for kids who are struggling in school with executive functioning, with achievement, with behavioral issues. So I hope we can grow that more. I hope we can get it into schools more. I hope we can educate people about how it works, and it can become a more mainstream therapy.
Thank you. So just the follow-up to that is a question about CPT codes. I think you responded to that earlier where they might be similar to the general psych codes or things like that. But if, when you send me the references, if you do have an idea of some codes that you can share too, I can send that out. We're coming just about up on 1 o'clock, so this presentation again was recorded. I will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow with the recording, the PowerPoint slides, and also the evaluation for those of you who would like to claim CME credit. And then lastly, just to say thank you again, Dr. Saltzman. This was a great presentation, and we really appreciated it.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.